We're going to begin now with our history survey considering the colonial era in English, the development of English colonial, English policy towards Native Americans. This, of course, is the backdrop to the creation of federal policy towards Native Americans. And it's going to cover a vast amount of time, the materials we're going to discuss now. And of course, it's impossible to comprehensively cover several centuries of the development of policy in the short amount of time that we have. So what I'm going to do is hit the high points. I want to leave you all with a feel for the trajectory of development, and especially a maybe more detailed and nuanced understanding of how the English finished with things, what federal or what Indian policy looked like within the British Empire in the lands that became the United States on the eve of the American Revolution, because that's the model that the founders of the new republic had to go by. And as you'll see in our next lecture, the founders eventually, although they came in with ideas of doing things differently, opted to simply adopt what the English had done in arranging their Indian affairs. So that's sort of the detail work we're going to do before we finish. But we also have to, I think, introduce a conceptual difficulty. And it's one that it's not unique to the English. I think the French get credit for sort of creating this notion originally. But the English certainly embraced it enthusiastically. And it's a conceptual difficulty, a sort of inconsistency in views about nature and the nature of discovered peoples in the Americas that still haunts us to a certain extent. And one of the themes of this course will be considering the extent to which federal policy today is still influenced by this early colonial notion of just who and what the Indians were. Of course, the notion that I'm thinking of is one that will be familiar to all of you. It's the notion of savagery and the flip sides. The noble savage idea is an idea that the English adopted from the French. The image that the English carried away from their earliest contacts with Native Americans was one of warm, gracious, welcoming people who didn't wear much in the way of clothes, didn't have writing systems that they could recognize, had very informal systems of government, maybe were closer to nature than the English had been for many, many generations. They were savage. They lived in the woods, as the English saw it, but they were noble savages. And we see this idea represented in images that accompanied the reports of the earliest settlers in the Virginia colony, the first permanent English colony in the New World, which was established in 1607. Images of the Werowance, or the Virginia lord, who looks very much, but for the way he's dressed, like an English nobleman would have looked in a portrait painted at the same time. And that's one side, but there's another side too that's equally suspect, and that's of what we might call the ignoble savage. It's the same guy, but he shows up one morning and massacres your family for reasons you don't entirely understand, that may have had something to do with your provoking him. And so we see images produced by artists at the same time. One illustration, a famous woodcutting of the massacre of 1622, when the Powhatan Indians attacked the Jamestown and nearby settlements. And the images don't look like battles, and it wasn't called a battle, it's called a massacre. And it's native peoples stabbing men who were sitting down to dinner, and women and children, and smashing heads, and this sort of thing. So there are two images that stand in stark contradiction to each other. And I think it's important to recognize how long those images have been a part of European perceptions of Native peoples in the Americas. Again, because I think we can trace through the development of federal Indian law and policy right up to the present day the lingering remnants of those motivations, of images in the minds of policymakers of Indian peoples either being sort of better adapted to live in nature, but at the same time incapable of exercising criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians because they don't have the same standards of civility or fairness or something. It's the noble and ignoble sides, but again attached to this image of savagery. And one of the objects for many tribal advocates is to sort of help the federal policymakers move past that, past those ancient colonial notions. But they're going to dominate thought in the formulation of policy for certainly the early part of the period that we're going to be talking about, including the whole of the colonial period that we're going to consider in this lecture. Now, what's motivating the English when they arrive here? Why are they colonizing this land, and what is it that's driving their policy? Well, to some of the colonists, who again start forming permanent colonies here in 1607, and then later in the 17th century, that's in Virginia, later in the 17th century, will settle Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies in New England, and then those will be the two nuclei of colonial intrusion into the inland areas, and then the middle colonies will develop, and colonies to the south of Virginia will eventually develop, some as late as the 18th century, including I'm thinking of the Georgia colony. So what were those people doing here, and how did they view their proper relationship with the native peoples that they found? Well, in New England in particular, you find a lot of folks interested in bringing the Christian religion to the indigenous people. And that's an important influence in a very limited part of the country for a very limited amount of time. It actually caused, there was a notion, a theory of colonization and land acquisition that was vetted by some of the leaders of the Puritan colonies that said that God in Genesis gave the world to humans to cultivate, and if you're not cultivating, by which they understood enclosing and farming land, then you are violating the will of God as clearly expressed in Genesis, and that means that you've forfeited your claim to ownership or occupancy of any lands, and the farmers are meant to come in and take them over so that they can fulfill the will of God. And this was held by some of the Puritan leadership to justify dispossession of native peoples in New England. But it's only fair to say that this wasn't universally subscribed to, this notion, even in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island, did so in part because he thought this was goofy and unfair to the native peoples. And it never became the dominant philosophy behind land acquisition universally in the English colonies. This Christianization notion had a certain appeal in the coastal areas where they could actually pull it off. But the deeper you got into the mainland of North America, the farther you got away from New England, the less interest there was in Christianization being the motivation or the justification for dispossession of native peoples. Practicality governed relations with native peoples much more strongly in the inland areas and in the southern areas than Christianization ever did. The idea that, look, we need to eat, you've got food, so you help us, and we've got stuff you want. Let's have trade relations, and as we'll see, let's enter into written agreements where we sort of set forth the boundaries between our communities and arrange the terms of our relationship. Christianization was, however, the driving force, at least as a theoretical matter, south of the English colonies. And I think it's important to take a minute and sort of understand just what the English were playing against. What was going on in Spanish America, what had been going on for a long time. Because the Spanish are the primary competitors. The French will become primary competitors of the English colonies too. And those are both Catholic nations, and they've got a different mission and a different set of instructions and imperatives. And in part, English policy can be understood as non-Spanish, and the design of English policy being driven in part by reaction against what the Spanish had done, as opposed to the creation of something new that the English wanted to inject into relationships with the tribes. So let's retreat momentarily in history. Columbus, Genoese navigator, under orders from the King and Queen of Spain, arrives in the Caribbean in 1492, and of course all hell breaks loose. He brings with him odd notions and diseases. The successors who arrive from Spain do the same thing. And this is the late 15th and early 16th century. There are no other Europeans in the neighborhood, in part because everybody is Catholic in Europe. The Pope has decreed that this is Spanish territory. The Portuguese get lands too, which will include the tip of Brazil because they drew the line in the wrong place, and Africa. But this new world is meant to be the domain eventually of the Spanish, because the Pope said so, and that's important to the theory of Spanish colonization. In 1513, Spanish lawyers drafted a document called the requerimiento, or the requirement. And this was the legal instrument that justified dispossession and subjugation in Spanish America. The requerimiento was a document that said, basically, hey, how's it going? It was read, by the way, we'll talk about the circumstances in a minute, to indigenous people, said, hey, how's it going? We are subjects of the King and Queen of Spain, who are subjects of and delegates of the Pope, who is God's and Christ's emissary on earth. And you know God, He's everything. So we're here to make sure you get that we work for God, and to invite you to admit that you too are subjects of the King and Queen of Spain, as we are, because the Pope, who's God's emissary, has given these lands to the King and Queen of Spain. And if you're willing to do that, then let the Christianization begin. We'll share the faith, and you guys can go about your business. But if you don't do that, and don't do that fast, then you have forfeited your right to everything, to your lands, to your life, to the security of your family. We will enslave your women and children. We will kill you. We will take all of your property. And it will be your fault because you rejected God's command to respect the authority of the King and Queen of Spain. The requerimiento, we're told, would be read on arrival in new areas by the Spanish conquistadores. It could be an empty beach. They could read it to a tree. They could read it to incomprehending people standing there wondering who the hell these folks were. But the legalities had been complied with. You read it, they don't understand it, doesn't matter. You let a little while pass, they don't come forward and subject themselves to the authority of the King and Queen of Spain, and then it's all yours. It's fair game. Now the Spanish could pull that off because in the early 16th century, they had an enormous military technological superiority over the indigenous peoples. metal weapons, swords, horses, armor. As well, they had an aptitude for forming strategic alliances against what were locally perceived as oppressive centralized empires, the Mexica or Aztec Empire in what became Mexico, the Incas in what became Peru. And so the Spanish devised this technique of decapitating empires with the assistance of allies, taking control of existing political infrastructures, and then holding on to that control through military technological superiority, with the rationalization, legal justification that they were doing God's will, as expressed in the text of the Requerimiento. None of this was possible for the English in Jamestown in 1607. They had no authority from the Pope. They were heretics. They had no military superiority. They were outnumbered. They were families. They weren't all men coming over in suits of armor. They were men, women, eventually children. They were trading communities for the most part. And there wasn't a chance in the world that they were actually going to be able to step up and say, we control you, we're going to conquer you unless you agree. Some may have come with that idea in mind, but it never actually had any hope of getting off the ground. Instead, practicality stepped in, as I mentioned earlier, and the English colonists started cutting deals with the native peoples. We need food, you'd like household goods, products that we've brought over, and so let's trade. And let's trade on paper. And so were born the treaties that are probably the most important legacy of the English colonial era, and one of the great hallmarks of federal Indian law today, the existence of treaties, signifying as a legal matter that both parties have the legal capacity to participate in treaty making, meaning that they're nations. Something again that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, the English colonies formed, treaties are being made, some between the Crown and the native peoples, but some between colonial governors and native peoples. And the colonies in the early days, the individual colonies became the central locuses for the creation of what we would call Indian policy and law. The Virginia colony had its own laws governing relations with indigenous peoples in Virginia. The Massachusetts colony did. The Pennsylvania colony did, and had fairly enlightened policies. And the governors would enter into treaty relations with the indigenous peoples as sort of heads of their own state. Now, what were the problems that arose? Well, the principal problem was not so much problems created by the colonies themselves, although a number of colonies did get involved in wars during during various parts of the colonial period, but problems created by individual colonists. And the main problem had to do, again, with land acquisition. The fact that there were treaties being made encouraged many individual colonists to go out and make their own treaties. Well, heck, I'll go, that's a really pretty farm. I'll go find whatever guy is living there, and I'll make a treaty with him. And I'll give him this, and he'll sell me his land, and then it'll be my farm. And this was aggravating the purported vendors and their communities and their nations, and seemed to be throughout the colonies a regular cause of military conflict. So virtually, every governor eventually got the colonial legislatures to pass a statute saying, cut it out. No more individual sales, purchases of Indian lands. From now on, only the colonial government can buy Indian lands or can enter into treaty relations with tribes. This isn't a restriction on the tribes, understand, it's a restriction on what individual colonists are allowed to do. And it became criminal to violate this prohibition on entering into treaties with tribes. And trade relations also, which carried with them the potential for abuse and subsequent military problems, trade relations were eventually regulated by every colonial government too. So, okay, so even if you want to trade with tribes, not for land but for other stuff, you've got to have a license from the colonial government. Now, this all worked well in theory, but imagine, if you will, how chaotic the frontiers in these colonies were from the perspective of the colonial government. There's no long arm of the law that stretches out into the mountains of western Pennsylvania. They have no way of enforcing most of these rules, the restriction on trading or the restriction on purchase. So the colonial experiment in we'll take charge of these relations eventually failed on both fronts, regulation of trade and regulation of purchases. And the Crown, by the middle of the 18th century, realized we've got to take charge of all of this, because the more and more people who we are sending to these colonies, the greater the opportunity for unregulated conflict with the Indians. So in 1755, the British Crown said, okay, from now on, Indian relations are an imperial matter, are a centralized matter. The Crown created 2 departments, a northern department and a southern department, for the conducting of Indian affairs. The northern department placed in the hands of a man named William Johnson, who becomes famous during this period. A guy named Edmund Atkin, later replaced by a guy named John Stewart, who was much more famous, takes charge of the southern department. And so they are the principal guys out there conducting relations with the tribes from 1755 on till the end of the British Empire. In 1756, war comes with some of the tribes, but more importantly from the English perspective, with France. This is the war we used to call the French and Indian War, because that's who the English were fighting against. The 7 Years' War more commonly, and it's really the first world war because it's fought in India, it's fought in North America, it's fought in Europe. And the war, not surprisingly, ends in 1763, because it's the 7 Years' War. Shortly before the end of the war, the king steps in again to try and persuade colonial governors and residents to stop aggravating the Indians in December 1761, ordering the governors to stop issuing land patents, so that the colonies are being completely pulled out of the Indian affairs business. The war ends in 1763, and the King of England, George III, against whom the United States will soon rebel, promulgates a proclamation, the Proclamation of October 7, 1763, which says, among other things, look, we said it a few years ago and we meant it, we don't want the colonial governors issuing land patents to Indian lands. We don't want English colonists living in Indian lands. And where are they? Well, we're going to draw a line down the ridge of the Allegheny Mountains, and everything west of that land is reserved to the Indians under our protection, the king's protection. And you people stay east of the line. And that's it. Certainly, at least for the time being. Well, that's 1763, and the colonists were absolutely furious. They thought they had fought the 7 Years' War to gain access to those lands. Those lands, most of them, by the way, had been French, but were acquired by the British, or whatever the French claims were acquired by the British, in 1763 when the 7 Years' War ended. Basically, all the lands in North America east of the Mississippi River are suddenly free of the French. But these are the lands, the newly acquired lands, and some of the old English colonial lands, now under the care of the king and reserved to the Indians, and the colonies have no power to mess with it. As we'll see when we talk about Johnson versus McIntosh, a number of savvy land speculators found a way around that prohibition and tried to make a killing, which ended up being a failed effort but gave rise to our first great landmark Indian law decision. That's a topic for a different lecture. What we care about now is the political reaction of the colonists to the Proclamation of 1763. And as I mentioned, folks were not happy. Within a decade, violence has erupted, in part generated by the proclamation, in part generated by suddenly enforced and newly passed taxes on colonists imposed by the British Parliament to pay for the 7 Years' War, which had been, in the view of many colonists, of no benefit to the colonies because of the proclamation's prohibition on land acquisition. December 1773, the Boston Tea Party. 6 months later, June 1774, the British step in again to try and get the colonists to cut it out, passing the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act provides a government for newly acquired French territories in Canada, but also assigns to the province of Quebec virtually the whole of the old, what we call Northwest. The states of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Michigan are made in 1774 part of the Quebec province and put under the control of that colonial administration. A lot of those lands had been claimed by Virginia and Pennsylvania and other states, and they were absolutely furious, the colonists in those states. And so in the fall of 1774, the colonists convened the First Continental Congress, and within 6 or 7 months at Lexington and Concord, they've started shooting at the British. And then, of course, in July 1776, as we'll see, the colonists declare independence. And that will finish the British colonial period as a matter of American law. The Declaration of Independence creates a new state, a new country, and in the next lecture we'll see what that new country did with the policy issues involved in relating to indigenous peoples in North America. We'll see the birth of a federal Indian law.